Sorry, due to an urgent commitment, Saul isn't here, and he sends his apologies for it, but it was unavoidable. So I've been asked to chair this, and this is a very easy job because we've got one of the regulars, and Professor Gary Sheffield, who was at Leeds University the year above me, because we were both in the same Observer Mates debating society. And I've still got a copy of the programme when we went up to Durham and did that. And since then, he was at King's College, did his PhD. He was at Professor in charge of the Birmingham War Studies, then was pinched and transferred to Wolverhampton to do there.
On a Bosman.
On a Bosman,
yeah,
right. On a Bosman free transfer, and has come back as visiting professor to King's College London. Now, Gary's one of those people who is completely associated with what is called the revisionist view of the First World War, and really very interesting in that, and has built a real reputation on reinterpreting some of the well-known thoughts about the First World War. So huge pleasure to welcome Gary to talk about the Battle of the Somme.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I can say, without fear of contradiction, that this is the first time you will have heard this lecture, because when I looked for the PowerPoint for my Battle of the Somme lecture that I put together 10 years ago, I couldn't find it. So I put together a new PowerPoint, so it's got some stuff. Well, my background, Jeremy's already mentioned, I studied Hague and the British Army and the Somme pretty intensively for about a dozen years, resulting in an edited version of Hague's Diaries and Letters, a biography of Hague, and a little book on the Battle of the Somme. And of course I've been writing and thinking about the Battle of the Somme for a very long time. So what I've tried to do today is to present both my sort of, research, which is going back a few years now, but also to put it into a broader context. And that context is attrition and armies as learning organisations, which is a taster, because I'll be talking about this sort of stuff, but for the Second World War when I come and see you next year. But the Somme, I think, only makes sense in this broader context. Let's kick off with some really basic stuff. What's the problem? Trench warfare. It boils down to this. There is a temporary dominance of the defensive over the offensive. And in the process of this tactical conundrum being sorted out, which it largely is, but not by the end of the Battle of the Somme, something which has been described as an RMA, a revolution in military affairs, occurs. I'll come back to that later, but in broad terms, my argument is that, excuse me, if Napoleon came back from Valhalla or wherever he is, in 1914, he would broadly have recognised the sort of war that was being fought at the beginning of the First World War. If he had delayed his return for 4 years to 1918, completely different. He wouldn't have had a clue. And the Somme, chronologically and I guess thematically, lies between those 2 points. And the Somme is, I think, not the only important turning point, but it is pretty significant. So why is the defensive temporarily dominant? Well, the first thing to say is that given what happens in 1914 with the failure of the French Plan 17, a dash into German-held territory, and the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, an encircling movement by the Germans into French-held territory, there are no flanks to turn. So classically, if you're faced with a very powerful obstacle, you try to go round it. You cannot go round it. You might think that you could do some sort of amphibious hook round on the coast for all sorts of reasons. That is not really feasible, certainly not in 1914 or 15 or 16. And you could go the other way round through Switzerland, but not only was that actually breach neutrality of a state, it's also over extremely bad territory. And don't forget the L-word logistics. How do you keep armies in supply? That's one fundamental point. So every attack needs to be made, in effect, frontally. Another key point is that there is no instrument of exploitation available to generals, to armies in the First World War. Not completely true, but I think it bears repetition. So, Scots Greys at Waterloo. I discussed at a party from this very club, the Caledonian Club, and I took them to Waterloo 2 years ago. And told them Lady Butler's painting is nonsense. They weren't wearing those hats, and they didn't have sort of spare Gordon Highlanders hanging off their stirrups and things like that. That aside, it's the classic image of Napoleonic cavalry, heavy cavalry, used to exploit a breakthrough. So infantry and the artillery create the breakthrough. You then need to move faster than the enemy can retreat to get among them, to save them, to destroy them. You could do that 100 years before. You could do it 25 years later, when armoured vehicles, tanks, armoured cars had effectively replaced horsed cavalry. In the First World War, cavalry is still there, there's quite a lot of it. On occasions, as we will see, it could be quite useful, but they simply could not be used in the same way as Napoleon had used it, or anything like that. And in the same way, armour comes on the scene, as we will see later. It's a very fragile weapon in 1916. In fact, remained so well into the 1920s. There is no instrument of exploitation, which means that time after time, generals, particularly the Allies, the British and the French, they're the ones who are on the offensive in the West for most of the war, punch a hole in an enemy position, but they're unable to take advantage of it. And so the Germans simply bring up their reserves, block the gap. The line might move forward a few hundred yards, but that's as far as it goes. Two examples I'll give later where things might have been different. The other point is that there are poor communications once troops went over the top. I found this great picture of an American soldier from the Second World War, captured, press to talk switch, not depressed while receiving. Why isn't this thing working? Take that finger off the button. Point is that walkie-talkies and equivalent radio communications, they're not brilliant in the Second World War, it must be said. They are largely non-existent in the First World War. That means once the troops go over the top into no man's land, effectively commanders have little or no chance of influencing what goes on. And that's ironic because up to the frontline trench, it's the best network, best connected armies in history. Because you've got field telephones, which you can dig trenches, put the wires in, cover them up, and actually Private Baldrick in the front line could have been spoken to by Field Marshal Haig, if Haig really wanted to do that. But once troops go over the top, then what can you do to maintain communications? You can pay out telephone wire behind you, and they did do that. Trouble is, it's very vulnerable to being cut by enemy shells, and there are numerous examples of signallers, signal officers and signallers, receiving gallantry awards of basically crawling out under machine gun fire and shell fire, finding the two ends, wrapping together some insulation tape, sticking them together to reconnect them, which lasts probably a minute before it gets cut by another shell somewhere else. Effectively, troops go over the top. They may as well be on the far side of the moon, as far as the command is concerned. So, one of the things I discovered when I did my biography of Haig I know what Haig was doing at midday on the 1st of July 1916, first day of the Battle of Somme. He was catching up with his routine paperwork. Now I know that because he actually dated and timed a particular letter. And at one level, you think that's absolutely disgraceful. You know, the men are fighting and dying, and what's Haig doing? He's catching up with his admin. Actually, it's probably good use of his time as any at that particular stage, because having set up the plans for over the top, he was receiving no useful information upon which he could make decisions, and so, yeah, catching up with your admins is probably good use of your time and everything else. Completely different, you know, fast forward to the Second World War or go back to Wellington or Lee or Grant, but that's this strange situation you have in the First World War. In effect, for generals, it is it's a war fought without voice communications. So whereas Wellington at Waterloo could send off his ADC and tell that battalion over there to form square or something, or in the Second World War, Patton or Rommel could get on the net and give an order. Haig, Foch, Ludendorff just couldn't do that. The technology was simply not there. All of this means that the defender has the advantage. Neuve-Chapelle, actually, the first battle fought by the British Expeditionary Force under conditions of trench warfare. Many of these things come into play. The British actually succeed in breaking through the German frontline trenches, almost make it through the second line, and because the trenches at this stage are actually not particularly deep, the defences, and yet they can't bring up reinforcements, and so therefore the battle sort of fizzles out inconclusively after 3 days fighting. Is it anybody's fault? I don't think it is particularly. It's just the state of play at that time, which makes breaking through under conditions of trench warfare incredibly difficult. Second problem, trench warfare. Britain needs to create a mass citizen army, basically from, not quite from nothing, but not far off. And once it's been committed, it undertakes a very, very severe form of on-the-job training in battle against the German army. Think of those two things. It helps to explain, if not to excuse, the heavy level of casualties. So what we see for the British Army in 1914-15 is what has been described by my former colleague, Professor John Bourne, as expansion and de-skilling. And the two things are inevitably linked. The regular British Army, which goes to war, 6 divisions of infantry plus cavalry in 1914, it's not quite all of the regular army. There are some bits and pieces across the globe, but it's pretty well ordered. Excuse me. At the end of the fighting in 1914, what's left of the British Army has been pretty pounded. So you've got large numbers of soldiers, experienced soldiers and officers who are either killed, wounded, incapacitated in some shape or form, yet others have to be sent home to help train the civilian armies, the citizen armies, which are being raised. So famously, there's Kitchener's poster. You have a mass recruitment of Kitchener's armies. You also have roughly the same number of men join the territorials. All of these are basically civilians in uniform. They're lacking in experience. What they desperately need are experienced leaders, whether it be sergeants or whether it be officers, and these are very, very thinly spread. Hence this idea of de-skilling. The army in August 1914, I think, was a very good, very small, but very, very good army. The army 6 months later is roughly 3 or 4 times as big, but it's far less professional. It's been de-skilled, partly because lots of these people coming in are civilians with effectively no military experience. They need to be trained, and the number of experienced troops is spread very thinly. Anybody recognise that young officer, by the way? Sorry? Ah, well, final round of applause for coming up with the Sassoon answer. No, it's not. It's actually Anthony Eden, later Prime Minister, of course. The youngest brigade major, brigade chief of staff in the British Army, aged 20. And that, I put that picture up there, quite like that picture. Basically, it makes the point that you're de-skilling, but then you're re-skilling. And you have, as someone once put it, that all of the best brains in the British Empire are available for the British, Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, South African armies. And you get some very, very good, talented soldiers, people who would not have joined the army under other circumstances, of which Anthony Eden is an outstanding example. But it takes time to train these people, and it takes time for them to gain experience, and of course many majors they're killed off early. So how well did the BEF adjust to trench warfare in the period before the Somme? Well, in 1915, I think that was one more heave, because Neuve-Chapelle, the lesson they took away from that was we almost got it right. So basically, if we just put one or two things right, next time it will work. What that doesn't take into account, excuse me, sorry, can I ask someone to get a glass of water? I should have done that. I've had a cough for about 3 weeks, which is very annoying. What they didn't take into account is the fact that the Germans also learned. And so on the back of Neuve-Chapelle, thank you, the British fixed various problems, the Germans also fixed various problems. The result was when the next attack goes in, over the bridge on the 9th of May, it's a complete disaster. Eventually, by the summer of 1915, the British have realised that weight of artillery is, if not the key, one of the keys. And that proves to be something which carries through to the Somme. So what we get in 1915 is one more heave to just fix the problem, push forward, relying on previous experience. So not only during the First World War itself, but looking back into recent military history, there was something very like the Western Front in the war between Japan and Russia in 1904-1905 in Manchuria. And after about 9 months of fighting, at cost of horrendous casualties, nonetheless the Japanese prevailed and managed to sort of break trench warfare. And the thinking is actually, well, okay, this is what war's like now. Nonetheless, victory will go to the side that has the most resources, the most artillery, and the greater willpower to fight on and win a battle of attrition. And so when people criticise generals for being unimaginative, they're actually drawing on the most recent examples. There are other examples, like the Boer War, which point in a different direction, but nonetheless, it is founded, at least to some extent, on study of recent experience. There's also a reliance of technology. I love this photo. Italian football team. Gas, of course, is used by the Germans for the first time in April 1915 at the Second Battle of Ypres. And the British, after all of this is absolutely dreadful, sort of inhumane, rest of it, then promptly adopted themselves. And so it's used at the Battle of Loos in September 1915. It doesn't work terribly well, but that's all sorts of reasons for that. But the big lesson they draw from that actually is not that gas is useless, is that they based their entire attack plan around gas. And gas is a very useful auxiliary put into a broader context of what's become known as a weapon system, teamwork in other words. So if you put everything on gas, it fails, doesn't get very far. Gas actually integrated with artillery, machine guns, infantry, and all the rest of it could be really, really effective, as it does become particularly in 1918. All of this means that the British Army, by the time that Kitchener's armies and the territorials have reinforced the regulars, in other words, Britain now has an army of roughly comparable size to that of the French and the Germans. Actually, it's smaller than both, but it's a continental scale army. The British Army is large, it's not terribly well trained, it's not particularly experienced, and at many levels it's not particularly well led. All of these things can be overcome in time, but time in 1916 is the one thing the Allies do not have on their side. Planning at the end of 1915, for the only time in the war actually, all the Allied powers get together and decide on a sequential series of attacks. So the Russians will attack, the British and the French will attack, the Italians will attack, not simultaneously, but rather one after the other. The idea is to put maximum pressure on the Central Powers. And the big Allied offensive is going to be on the Somme. Why? Because the River Somme in Picardy is the place where the British and the French armies join. The French army does not wholly trust the British to do it on their own because they're inexperienced. They're not wrong about that. And so the French army is going to take the lead, except that between December 1915, when these plans are thrashed out, and July 1916, when they kick off, in February, in fact, February 21st to be precise, the Germans attack at Verdun, to the east, to the southeast of the Somme, and piecemeal, the French army gets sucked into this dreadful attritional struggle. I can talk more about Verdun in the questions if you like, but from our point of view, the key thing is that the French reach a point they can no longer be the lead army on the Somme. It has by default to be the Brits, and so you have the inexperienced British army. The original plan is it will basically be nursed or mentored in its first action by the larger French army. No, actually it's the Brits leading off. And I think helps to explain an awful lot about what happens later. The planning for the Somme is also bedeviled by not entirely wonderful relations between these two men. On the right, of course, as you look at the screen, General, as he still is at that time, Sir Douglas Haig, and Lieutenant General is at that time Sir Henry Rawlinson. Rawley is the commander of 4th Army, and it's the main operational army used on the Somme. 3rd Army to the north takes part in the fighting at the very, very beginning. And these two men have history. It's Rawlinson who was the 4th Corps commander, so operating at a level lower, at Neuve-Chapelle in 1915, and Haig at that time was 1st Army commander. He's his direct boss. Haig blames Rawlinson for failure to exploit the gaps which opened up in the German defences. It's a bit unfair, but it's not entirely unjust. Rawlinson, however, scapegoats Joey Davis, who's one of his divisional commanders, and basically blames Davis for the failure to break through. Davis declines to be scapegoated. He goes to Haig, who goes to Sir John French, who's the overall commander at the time, and basically Rawley is then on the mat. He's accused of lying, and his career hangs in the balance. And he's nearly sacked, but in the end he isn't. And Haig writes in his diary a bit later that basically, why did I pick him to be the commander of 4th Army, my lead commander? He said, because he's an able soldier, although not necessarily an honest man. He's the best of the bunch, basically. And Haig, although he personally doesn't like him that much, he certainly doesn't like being lied to, thinks he really probably is the best man for the job. Now, there's a lot of writing about the relationship between these two men, and one school of thought has you believe that Haig was so terrifying that no one dared to stand up for him and no one dared to sort of argue against his plans. Absolute nonsense. You just need to look at the relationship between Haig and Rawlinson. They spent literally weeks before the Somme begins arguing the toss about what's going to happen. Broadly, Haig is looking for a breakthrough followed by exploitation, and he's actually formed what's known as Reserve Army under Lieutenant General Sir Hubert Gough, which basically consists of cavalry formations with infantry formations, and the point is that they're supposed to take advantage of breakthroughs and then basically rupture the German front once it's cracked, and then have an operational level victory, so a substantial advance of the defeat of the German army. Rawlins, on the other hand, is one of the leading proponents of what becomes known as bite and hold, which is that rather attempting these big scale manoeuvres, what you need to do is essentially to mass your artillery, smash up the enemy positions, then march your infantry on top, stop, dig in, let the enemy expend itself in counterattacks, which is part of German doctrine, so actually that works quite well, and do the whole thing all over again, and again, and again. So take a bite out the enemy position, hold it, smash up counterattacks, do it again. Now the two things are not actually necessarily completely polar opposites. You can combine the two, later in the war they are. But it's a fundamental misunderstanding, no, not a misunderstanding, a fundamental disagreement about what the British plan is going to be from the 1st of July. Problem is, Haig thinks it's going to be a breakthrough, Rawls are determined that it isn't. And so, I wrote about this, and not everybody agrees with it, but I actually think if there's a villain to look for the 1st of July, Haig makes all sorts of mistakes. But the real villain is Rawlinson, who basically sabotages the one chance the British have on the 1st of July of making a substantial breakthrough. Having said that, Haig really was never going to advance 50 miles away. It was never going to happen. Even a 20-mile advance, under the circumstances of 1916, would have been a major political and military victory. As you can see, I'll explain in a bit, I think Rawlinson threw that away. Okay, the attack plan, 1st July 1916. There's two armies involved, up in the north, around the, actually invest a laser pointer one of these days, never mind. Up in the north, around the Gommecourt salient, Allenby's Third Army is attacking. Essentially, that's a diversion operation. Really, they're aiming to drag the German reserves to that area and also eliminate this the Gommecourt salient. Apparently the German soldiers of Gommecourt salient are the westernmost soldiers in the entire German army, an army that stretches right way back into Russia. And the divisions also attack, we have the 46th North Midland, the 56th London Division. They're both territorial, so largely pre-war volunteers with some wartime volunteers as well. There's then a gap held by the 48th South Midland Division, which doesn't attack on the 1st of July. And then you have Fourth Army's attack, 8th Corps here, 10 Corps here, 3rd Corps in reserve and around here, and then 15th Corps as well in reserve, 13 Corps down here, and the French. Bigger British map, the French are missed off naturally. The French 6th Army are down here. Excuse me. So that's the broad picture. The main axis of advance actually is straight up the road from Albert, the little town on the British side, through to Bapaume, and all being well, Bapaume will be taken probably on the evening of the 1st of July. Doesn't happen like that. Broadly speaking, in the northern part of the battlefield, there's unrelieved failure. Up at Gommecourt, the 56th London Division, here I'm sort of betraying my regional prejudices, do remarkably well, fighting up from the south of the salient. The 46th North Midland Division, recruited in Staffordshire, Wolverhampton, places like that, for all sorts of reasons, don't do very well. And so the 56th Division actually, in the end, had to fall back empty-handed. And you have pretty well unrelieved failures all of the northern part of the line. The attack of the 36th Ulster Division is particularly significant, partly because what it still means in Northern Ireland to this day, but also I think it tells us an awful lot about what went wrong for the British Army and what they can do about fixing it. But the first thing to say is that this, at this stage, is it's known as Carson's army. It's basically Ulster Protestant force based on the Ulster Volunteer Force, which ironically enough had been poised to go into action against the Crown when the First World War broke out. And they are fighting partly to sort of prove to the powers that be that actually loyal Northern Ireland, or Protestant Northern Ireland, should not be submitted to Home Rule from Dublin. Problem is, there's an Irish division, the 16th Irish Division, basically Catholic nationalists, who are fighting for pretty much the same reason, except they're fighting to prove they should be given Home Rule within the Empire. So this is not going to end well, I think it's fair to say. But it's part of this mythology to this day, famous picture of the Ulster's attack. Some of them were allegedly wearing their orange sashes over their equipment. I think it may have happened on one or two occasions, but it certainly wasn't a regular thing. Anyway, but it's significant culturally to this day. The Ulster Division do very well. They storm out of, I think I'm probably going to point to the map for this. They storm out of Teakvale Wood, so basically this is their trenches. They get across no man's land, and they get up as far as the Schwaben Redoubt, which is this very strong German position within the German second line. They do very, very well. Why is this? Well, I think there's two factors. First of all, that actually these are one of the formations which actually got out of their trenches and into no man's land before the barrage lifted. Hence, they weren't clambering over the top and starting. They started with an advantage. Not the only ones to do it by any means, but it worked particularly well for them. They're really fired up. They really are up for it. And something's often forgotten, but I think really pretty critical. They actually are supported by a battery of French artillery. Now, in 1916, it's relatively easy to produce a competent infantryman really quickly. It's much more complex and time-consuming to do the same for gunners. By the end of the war, in fact, much before that, the Royal Artillery becomes excellent, a real battle winner. But in July 1916, they have not yet reached that point. The French, however, basically have a larger artillery arm to start with. They've already been at war for 2 years. French artillery is very good. So I think French artillery plus Ulster, get up and go for it, combines to pull off a major success. But, here's the big but. Once they reach the Schwaben Redoubt, they suddenly look on their flanks and realise that the division on either side have not managed to get forward. So they basically shove their head into a bag or a noose. Once the Germans realise they've contained the attacks on either flanks of the Ulster Division, they do the obvious thing, they concentrate everything on the Ulsters, and gradually they are driven back from position to position to position. So in the end, I think they end up holding some of the frontline German troops, but they lose most of their gains. So it just shows what, even in 1916, given decent artillery and decent infantry, you can achieve, but it's not going to do you much good if you've only done one section of the front, which means you can get clobbered from both sides. So you get pretty well unrelieved failure north of the Albert-Bapaume road. The further south you go, however, the more success you get. And some of the same reasons apply, because the British are attacking next to the French First Army, and 13 Corps, which is the most southernmost British Corps, definitely gains from having supported this very, very effective French artillery support. Also, the divisions in 13 Corps, particularly 18th Division, it's commanded by Major General Ivor Maxey, one of the best trainers in the British Army, who goes on to become Inspector General of Training in 1918 and a Corps Commander. And it's an exceptionally well-trained division. These are basically blokes from the southeast of England, Midlands, who had been bank clerks and what have you before the war, but they are one of the better trained British divisions on the Western Front, thanks to Maxey. The other point, which is really quite significant, is that the terrain in the south, held by the Germans, is a lot less formidable than in the north. Has anybody been to the Somme? Well, you know, if you're north of the road, it's very hilly. The Germans always have the high ground, looking down onto the bricks. The south is a lot more gentle, and also the Germans simply aren't there in such strength. And so, the terrain, the lack of troop density, support of the French, decent troops, and also the British in 13 Corps are firing a primitive form of creeping barrage. Now what this means is the shells are firing the guns are firing a curtain of shells in front of the infantry. The infantry have to keep up with the barrage. If you hang back, that's a bad thing because it probably means that the enemy can then pop up out of a shell hole and shoot you in the back. They're willing to lose 10% casualties through drop shots. Basically, you know, wandering into your own barrage, you lose less men that way than if you hold back. Put all these things together. Oh, by the way, one of the gunners who's instrumental in doing this is a certain Major Alan Brooke, whatever happened to him. So basically you've got good commanders, good artillery, favourable terrain, weaker defences, French on your flank, surprise, surprise, this is where everything starts to come together. We'll come back around here. This is the point at which I think that there is a chance for a real operational strategic success on the Somme. Because here you've got the failure north of the line, here you've got success. You can see the ground, that's the stripy areas, I hope you can see, that's the ground that is gained. And the German defences in the south basically collapsed. The French, having pushed forward and basically looking over their shoulders and saying, whether it's, oh, okay, they're quite close behind. At exactly the point when, if Haig's plan had been adhered to, the mobile reserves would have been committed to go through the gap. Rawlinson has already told them to stand down, they are not going to use that day. To be fair, had he not done that, they wouldn't have found it easy to get through this gap because inconveniently the German collapse hadn't happened here on the road, it happened further south. But nonetheless, you know, there's still a chance, even on the following day, the German defences are in a mess, you could have done something about it. Rawlinson simply does not believe in this concept, refuses to listen to the stories coming to the front. There's even a local operational reserve, the 9th Scottish Division, which goes on to do bigger and better things later in the conflict. That's basically, they're not, they're told to stand down, you're not needed. Just at the point where you actually throw forward an extra infantry division and you might succeed in consolidating this area here. Doesn't happen. Rawlinson actually comes to realise what he's done, I think, because he's writing letters left, right and centre after the battle, covering his tracks, sending letters to people like King, you know, senior generals. I think he realises what he's done. Haig doesn't realise what has happened immediately. He then comes to hear about it, and reading between the lines, I think he was called in for a meeting in which the Nescafe was not terribly evident. And this is one of the milestones of a very rocky relationship between Haig and his operational commander. Okay. Failure of the 1st of July, the battle of course goes on into November, and I'm not going to talk about it all in any sort of detail, I'll pick out a few highlights. The point to see is that the Allies do gradually edge forward. In the end they gain about 7 miles, which for the vast expenditure of lives, it's very easy to write it off and say this is a complete waste of space and it's a disaster. As I'll explain in a moment, I don't think that's a fair assessment. but certainly it does not achieve the first of Haig's stated objectives, which actually is to break through. But again, often overlooked, but it's very clear, the evidence is very, very clear. Haig has a plan A and a plan B. Plan A is breakthrough. Plan B is, if that doesn't work, fight a battle of attrition to wear the enemy down. Because Haig is aware that the Allies have deeper pockets in terms of manpower resources than the Germans. Ultimately, if it comes to an attritional battle, the Allies will win, all things being equal. And of course, the big critical factor is, does morale remain high enough? And actually, it turns out number 16, indeed it does. So we get 14th of July, an attack really in the 13 and 15 Corps area, which is where the British are very successful on the 1st of July. They change the tactics quite dramatically. It's on a much narrower frontage. It's basically an attack only in this area. The Kitchener troops are actually deployed at night. They go out into no man's land. And this is quite an important factor because the generals have realised that they are capable, soldiers are capable of being more tactically proficient than they thought they were. 9th Scottish Division, which is the reserves not used on the 1st of July, one of the divisions which go out into no man's land at night, they attack at dawn, and they succeed in storming across and capturing the German trenches. Again, if you ever go to battlefield tours to Somme, one of my favourite stands is Caterpillar Valley Cemetery, which is on the ridge which is captured by the British on the 14th of July. You can stand at the back of the cemetery, look back to the start line for 1st of July, and then you can talk about the attack. You then go forward to the cemetery, and you can talk about, go here again, the battle for these two woods, Delville Wood and High Wood. So basically the cemetery is about here. Another one of these great mitre-beams, because the Germans are in bits. They have been broken really, really significantly, and these two woods, High Wood and Delville Wood, which have cost tens of thousands of lives in being captured in later July, August, September 1916, are there for the taking. So why aren't they occupied? Well, the short answer is that British don't do anything wrong particularly, but the assault troops at once they've actually captured Bazantin Ridge, which is where confusingly Caterpillar Valley Cemetery is located, they're blown, they're exhausted, they've lost their numbers, they're not really in any fit position to exploit. But you do have cavalry. And in fact, you've got two regiments, the Deccan Horse, which is an Indian regiment, and the 7th Dragoon Guards. They are brought up to exploit. As bad luck would have it, or possibly bad planning, they're actually in 15 Corps sector over here, not in 13 Corps sector. So they have to be redeployed before they can get forward. And so they don't come into action until the late afternoon, early evening. When they do, the stories that you've often heard about cavalry being used on the Western Front, well, not always true. This lot managed to gallop forward. They take advantage of the terrain. So basically, they go through a little low gully. They burst out in front of the German defences here. The Germans are a bit stronger than they had been earlier in the day, because they've been filtering people forward. And they basically catch the German infantry machine gunners, and they sabre them, they spear them with their lances. And then, because they are modern First World War cavalry, they dismount. One man in every four is told off as a horse holder, so they lead the horses back. The rest of them act as infantry. So in effect, they're mounted infantry. It's not putting it, exaggerating too far. They're sort of the modern, the old equivalent of what is now modern mobile, maybe mechanised infantry. And they go forward and they push into High Wood. they're just a bit late. The Germans have actually got sufficient there to stop them, so they capture a bit of highwood. They can't get all the way through. But again, there is an example, I think, that with a little bit more luck, perhaps slightly better planning, there could have been a significant breakthrough. I remember being on a staff ride, a military staff ride with the late Professor Richard Holmes, one of my mentors and a good friend, and hearing him standing on Caterpillar Valley Cemetery and painting his wonderful word picture about the gap between these two woods. And it says something along the lines of, the entire resources of the British Empire were straining against it for 3 months. It couldn't break through for the reasons we talked about earlier. What happens instead is that there is vicious fighting for Delville Wood, for Highwood, indeed of other woods in the area. Marshal Joffre, the guy on the left, is very keen for Haig to carry on hammering away in the north after the fate of the 1st of July. Haig politely demurs, and there's actually a sort of a table-banging, fist-shaking meeting. One of the good things to come out of that is that General, later Marshal Foch, who Haig has worked with earlier in the war and thinks highly of, is put in as, in effect, the coordinator between the British and the French on the Somme. And the two armies start to work together more efficiently as a result. The next major attack is launched on the 15th of September, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Now, most famous, of course, for the first use of tanks. There is some debate about whether Haig was wrong to use the tanks before there were sufficient numbers to make a difference. I don't think he was wrong at all. The tank was a very fragile and cumbersome beast in September 1916. It's never going to be a war winner in the First World War. It just isn't. And I think it's impossible to keep the secret anyway. And so the tanks go into action, and in some cases they work quite well, in other cases they don't. The worst place where they go very badly wrong is attacking the High Wood, basically because the numpty of a corps commander insists on sending them actually into the wood, despite the fact you've got these sort of stumps all over the place, which the armour's not very strong, and it's bogged down, and despite the fact the tank is told that's not a very good idea, sir, he sends them in anyway. So elsewhere where they're used on better terrain, they're actually pretty effective. The fighting goes on until November, and the last throw of the dice is the Battle of the Ancre. In other words, this is back to the northern part of the battlefield. Reserve Army, renamed Fifth Army, has taken over the northern part of the battlefield from after the initial attack, under Gough. And the Battle of the Ancre is a minor success. It's a very limited battle. A few objectives are taken, including embarrassingly those that are supposed to fall on the first day. But taken they are, and Haig, I think, is able to sort of claim a degree of success and shut the battle down. The other one I want to make about the Ancre, and this is actually the field kitchen of the 2nd Manchesters, the Ancre, in November 1916. The weather is absolutely appalling. It's pouring with rain, thick mud. People who were to fight a year later at Passchendaele reckon Somme mud was worse, and some of the worst conditions endured by British soldiers in the First World War, Battle of the Ancre. But at the end of it, the British Army's morale, wouldn't say it's sky high, but it's okay, it's intact. And I think the key thing is that the army was really poorly trained and inexperienced in July 1916. Now it's reasonably well trained and it's a lot more experienced. And that's a real plus. In the process, I mentioned this idea of a revolutionary military affairs has occurred. The introduction of what's been known as three-dimensional war. In 1914, if you wanted to fire your artillery piece at a target with any chance of hitting it, you need to have line of sight. Look at it and make your adjustments accordingly. However, they discovered very early on, as early as autumn 1914, if you put a man in an aeroplane with a radio set, you can then put the aeroplane up in the air and you can literally and metaphorically see over the hill. You can spot enemy trenches, you can radio back bearings for the guns. The guns, the signals on the ground then pass on to the artillery. The artillery then can start to hit with increasing accuracy this enemy targets. One of the reasons I said Napoleon would have understood warfare in 1914, not in 1918, this is beyond anything that he was able to do. And it is fundamentally the beginning of the sort of warfare that we see being fought to this very day. That's not the only change. You have infantry tactics, as far as the British are concerned, go from the wave, basically long lines of men advancing into action with rifles and bayonets being principal weapons, to the worm, which is the use of much looser formations. You know, blob is another term to use for it. And the principal weapon, sorry, I'll run that again, is not the rifle, it's the Lewis gun. Light machine gun, well, light in a relative sense, you pick it up and you'd know it. This is an Australian platoon from roughly 2 years later, and this is one of the greatest changes in tactics during the war. So, and the British, not the only people to do this, so the British and Empire forces, also the French, also the Germans, they're all learning to fight modern warfare. Plus you throw in armour, you throw in much better coordination with the artillery, you throw in some cases the use of air power in a direct ground attack role. Modern warfare is alive and well in 1918. And the Somme, I think, is a really important crossover point in which these lessons are learned. Leading to the next major battle the British Expeditionary Force fights, Arras in 1917, it includes the capture of Vimy Ridge, as I'm always careful to point out to my Canadian friends, by Canadian and British forces. And here, if you like, you see the payoff of the learning, that the infantry tactics, artillery, and the rest of it is much more sophisticated. Hence, you have not only the capture of Vimy Ridge on the first day of Arras, various British divisions advance 3 miles into enemy territory, which is unheard of by 1916 standards. So you get a huge tactical improvement. And the Germans know it. The Germans are really worried by what the Somme does. And there are 3 things which emerge from this. First of all, that the old, slightly wussy German leadership is, wussy compared to what comes next, is swept aside and replaced by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who effectively become dictators of Germany. They keep the civic cabinet in place, but they're the one who are pulling the strings. And they enhance their idea of total war. The so-called Hindenburg program basically seeks to militarize the entirety of German society. It's wildly overambitious and fails. It also alienates big chunks of the German population, particularly the working classes. Germany had the biggest trade union and socialist organisation in Europe before 1914. All of this leads to big tensions in Germany, which plays out in the long run. What's the new strategy? Well, the strategy is the British have shown that they are now a major player on land. They're clumsy, but there's lots of them, and they are there. Therefore, we will attack them from the air. Doesn't really work because air power simply isn't up to it in 1917, but critically it's sea. That means they will release the U-boats, who have been restrained from attacking everything in sight. They will unleash the U-boats to try and sink enough merchant shipping to starve Britain into submission. They know if they do this, the Americans, the United States, will not be very pleased. But their gamble is that if the Americans do enter the war, that Britain will have been knocked out of the war, and been starved out of the war before the Americans could make a difference. And what this German plan does in the space of 6 months, in fact not even that, 4 months, after the end of the Battle of Somme, is to get America from this situation. So, the Americans nicely neutral in the middle, basically, cocking a snook at Brits, French, Germans, anybody else, to this. Germany enters the war in April 1917. In the short term, it doesn't make that much difference in military terms because the Americans take a year to deploy their army. In financial terms and in naval terms and in terms of boost of morale and actually declining German morale, it's absolutely massive. This is a consequence, albeit not an intended one, of the Battle of the Somme. So you mustn't judge the Somme simply on ground gained, lives lost. Sorry, I haven't told you number of lives. It's dreadful, Butcher's Bill. Something like 420,000 British casualties, not all dead. 200,000 French casualties, German casualties, minimum 400,000, probably more like 600,000. So we're talking about vast numbers of people killed and wounded. And of course, there's more to come. I haven't got time to talk about 30, Passchendaele. Set aside the images of Passchendaele, it goes wrong operationally, tactically, and to some degree, actually strategically, it's not an outright victory, but it's a success. But it's not just attrition on the battlefield. It's not just killing large numbers of Germans who cannot be replaced the same way the Allies replaced theirs. It's also attrition of the German home front. Not a sick cartoon for a British magazine here. You've got this very middle-class German family. They're very well dressed. Gottstraff England is the thing on the wall. They're eating the family pet. Now, what's critical about this? This is not working class people who have been used to privation. These are middle classes, or when they're starting to be here, there's a serious problem. And tensions within Germany start to escalate. And you, even by the sort of spring of 1918, you have this low-level, near civil war simmering in Germany, which with defeat on the battlefield at the end of the year explodes into full-blown civil war and revolution. Why doesn't that happen to the British and the French? Well, part it's because of food, and it's because of British domination of the seas. Basically, if there's anywhere that has a seaport, the British can export food to Britain and to France. And people don't get fat in the First World War. In Britain and France, they don't starve either. People are literally starving in Germany and Austria-Hungary. And also, where you've got Ludendorff and Hindenburg basically cracking on with enhanced total war and all that means. Britain and France go for a different approach. They carry out what's been known as remobilisation. They bring democratic, popularist people to the fore. David Lloyd George in Britain, Georges Clemenceau in France, both of whom are fairly radical in their politics, and they mobilise the people, so they're not just fighting against it, they're fighting for something as well. So the best example of this, I guess, from the British point of view, is the 1918 Representation of the People's Act, which famously enfranchises women over the age of 28. Not these flighty young girls can't trust with the vote, clearly. But also, what's often forgotten, it enfranchises much of the British male working class. Which basically means people are fighting for, they've got a stake in society. And you get much the same sort of approach in France. Completely different, a democratic approach, if you like, as opposed to I'm reluctant to use the word fascist because it isn't actually fully fascist, but it's sort of on the road to fascism. You can see the glimmers of it there in Germany. And in 1918, you get the payoff of the learning process. Ludendorff, as the effective German commander-in-chief, learns the wrong lessons. He goes for stormtroopers, highly trained, highly motivated infantry, who, to be fair, do very well in their initial attacks against the British Fifth Army on the 21st of March 1918. But they break through, he's unable to sustain the advance, and critically, they leave the artillery behind. So once they've broken through the frontline British trenches, they come into further back positions, they're attacking infantry without proper artillery support. British and French learn the right lessons, which is actually to support all attacks with artillery, in fact more than that, the whole idea of an integrated weapon system, to make it logistically sustainable. So whereas the Germans gain advances which are impressive on the map, they capture a lot of ground, they simply can't be sustained. Whereas the British and the French, and of course Foch is elevated to the Supreme Allied Commander in April 1918. The British and the French, British also include Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, even some South Africans. The Americans are coming on stream by the stage, the Belgians are coming on stream. They fight shallow, limited battles, which are logistically supported, and they have absolutely massive amounts of firepower. That's the key to victory in 1918, which I think is learnt very largely at the Battle of Somme in 1916. Christmas presents, anybody?
So thank you very much, Gary. What we'll do is we'll take two lots of questions. Questions now should be based on Somme. Questions at dinner can be slightly wider ranging. Yes.
Yeah. Gary, you mentioned that I think tens of divisions of the French army were moved to Verdun, as I believe happened on the opposite side on the Germans, moved a lot of their divisions to Verdun. And yet, effectively, or essentially, the battle plans remain the same. They didn't change. If that's correct, has there ever been scenario played out as to what would happen if the Germans didn't move all their divisions and the British didn't move, or the French divisions hadn't have gone? Would there have been a material difference, do you think?
I don't know if anybody's ever done that as a sort of formal war game. I suspect it wouldn't have made that much difference, except I think the Germans would have been in better shape at the beginning of the Somme. Yeah. I cannot stress this enough. I mean, the British, understandable reasons, 60,000 casualties on the first day of the Somme, 19,500 dead. We have emblazoned on our collective memories the Somme is a disaster for the Brits. It is. It's also a disaster for the Germans. The Germans suffer appallingly badly. 1st of July 1916 is not the first day of the Somme for them, it's the 8th day, because they've already been enduring a 7-day bombardment. Now, the bombardment's not particularly effective for all sorts of reasons. It kills lots of people, it traumatises lots of people. And one of the key achievements at the beginning of the Somme, actually, is on the 11th of July, so 10 days after the Battle of the Somme begins. The Germans stop all their offensive operations at Verdun. From that point onwards, the French are able to sort of start clawing it back. And because the Germans have actually had their troops sucked further to the south, that's one of the reasons why it's relatively weak on the southern sector with the British 13th Corps and the French. Had there been more German divisions there, then maybe there wouldn't have been that same degree of Allied success. I think it makes, I should say more about this really, but I think it makes sense to see Verdun and the Somme as sort of even twins, in which one battle affects the other one, and then as the Somme kicks in, then that starts to affect Verdun. So actually the French increasingly start to transfer men back from Verdun to the Somme from sort of September onwards, and so they take a much bigger part in the battle. But really, I think it makes sense to see Verdun and the Somme as being part of the same sort of killing match, which is, from the point of view, I mean, from a humanitarian point of view, it's absolutely dreadful. You know, you cannot defend it. From a military point of view, it's actually quite effective as a use of attrition.
Yes.
When Haig wanted his breakthrough, if he got it, where would he have gone?
Okay, well, this one I have actually sort of thought about and measured out. I think he might have got about 20 miles. Which
Not much.
it's not much, no, it isn't. I mean, he could not have achieved the breakthrough he was intending. I think because, unusually for Haig, I don't think he'd actually taken into account the logistics of it. Unless he's hoping the entire German army is going to fall apart, unlikely to happen. So he's not going to get the major breakthrough that he wants. However, as I said in my talk, a 20-mile advance, I mean, that actually would be something. It would certainly unhinge the bottom of the Western Front. It would probably mean the Germans would have had to pull back quite considerably further north, probably back to where the Hindenburg line was constructed in sort of September, October 1916, but they would have pulled back much earlier. It also would have been huge kudos for the Brits in their relationship with the French. It would, I think, shored up the British government. It should have Haig, certainly, and also probably have done something to damage the morale of the Germans. So Haig is never going to pull off the massive sort of Napoleonic battle that he hopes for, but it wouldn't have been nothing. It would have been, a really quite successful game. But I forgot to say actually that very good book on the Somme from the French point of view, written by my colleague, King's colleague, William Philpott, Bill Philpott, who's really looking at sort of the French army, and he very much brings the French map into it. He calls his book Bloody Victory. I have never called the Somme, I've forgotten which is about the whole war, by the way. I've never called the Somme a victory, simply because I think it's a wrong term. Victory for me comes up ideas, I don't know, Waterloo or even Alamein or D-Day, something like that. It's not a victory, it is a strategic success. Because overall, for the reasons I've given, it really makes a difference to the way that the Allies and the Germans then fight the war. Is it a victory? No. Is it Allied success? Yes.
Gary, we talk about artillery quite a bit, but let's try and put it in context in terms of years 15 to 16 to 17. Surely the impact of the artillery was much diminished in the earlier years because of the lack of supply of shells and the calibre and the quality of the shells, as well as the calibre and quality of the divisions.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Yeah, for those who don't know, the British munitions industry has to be really ramped up at the beginning of the war, because the pre-war planning for artillery fire expenditure in the next war is based on the World War, the Second South African War. And basically, if you're going to fight that sort of war on the Western Front, you're going to fire off your entire stock of shells using the entire World War in 2 weeks. And so gunners in 1914-15, even early 1916, are having to ration their shells. Certainly, in order to fight the artillery-intensive operation on the Somme, gunners further north, around Arras, around Ypres, are rationed to 2 or 3 shells a day. So it's robbing Peter to pay Paul, in a sense. It's also, I think, significant. I mentioned training of gunners is actually quite difficult. Britain simply does not have enough medium and particularly heavy artillery at the beginning of the war. And you can't just magic these things out of thin air. The Allies come up with a production plan in the spring of 1915, which will increasingly see guns and ammunition appearing on the Western Front. When's that plan due to be completed? Spring of 1918. The best one in the world, we can't just simply magic these things up. If you compare what the status of British artillery is in the fighting for the Hindenburg line in September 1918, effectively they've got more artillery and more shells they know what to do with. So they fired like 1 million shells, just over 1 million shells, in the attack on the Hindenburg line, and those shells were replaced within 48 hours. A year earlier, fighting at Passchendaele, they simply did not have that number of guns, that number of shells. They certainly didn't have it on the Somme. So artillery is really important, but it's more, this is what we can do when we've got everything we need. John Moore, my colleague I've mentioned, said that Britain was fighting a poor man's war up to 1917. By 1918, it's fighting a rich man's war. Britain has unlimited supplies of everything apart from soldiers. But actually, shells, machine guns, aircraft, tanks are used to substitute for manpower very often in 1918. Battalions on the Somme, full strength, roughly 1,000. Battalions at Amiens 2 years later, maybe 400. And yet the battalion of 1918 has something like 40 times the amount of firepower at its disposal. It could be two different wars.
Gary, you spoke about training several times. I'm thinking, so far as the infantry were concerned, what kind of training would be required? Because you were marched up into the trenches. One day somebody blew a whistle, you jumped up and ran hell for leather. What kind of training do you need for that?
Well, you have neatly expressed the Blackadder point of view, which you'll be surprised to know isn't actually historically accurate. Okay, the training that infantry undergo in 1916 for the Battle of Somme, pretty rudimentary, but it's not rudimentary as that. The idea is that essentially these wartime volunteers are thought to be incapable of doing anything more complicated than following a barrage or indeed following an officer. It's not quite as crude as blowing whistles over the top. But nonetheless, there's something to that. But also on top of that, you need to be trained for trench warfare, because actually simply holding a trench is something quite complicated and in a whole series of what's the word, sort of practices and whatever the expression is. Sorry, my momentary brain freeze.
No.
Techniques and practices, and so I've recently been reading a battalion history of a territorial unit. I don't believe the stuff I've been reading recently. Just trying to get this book finished. And which it's a territorial unit from a very working class London area, and they really don't give a monkeys about what they say. So they're rude about their senior officers. So you don't normally get in regimentals. You do in this one. And they talk about the shock of going into the trenches and finding how complex it is, how much there is to learn about reliefs, about wiring, the rest of it. And above all, they say it's hard physical labour. Something which really didn't, I knew some intellectually, but actually sometimes it takes a quote like that to make the point. When almost inevitably when men are going into battle, certainly in this war, they're physically tired. It's exhausting just getting to the front line through the trenches and what have you. After the 1st of July, it became, particularly after the 14th, it became clear that the British citizen armies are much more tactically adept than people thought. And so the training actually is ramped up quite considerably. And you can see this in some of the doctrinal pamphlets which have been published towards the end of 1916. But some of these things are coming a lot earlier. So I mentioned the idea of the worm rather than the wave. The army which attacks at Arras, so April 1917, the next major battle after the Somme, has been thoroughly trained on a different doctrinal basis, which has been enshrined in doctrinal pamphlets, based partly on British experience, also on talking to the French. So actually the French do very well in late 1916 recapturing key places at Verdun. And the army which attacks in April 1917 is light years ahead of that of 1916, largely because of better training which is informed by experience and basically learning as they're going along. And the further the war goes on, the better trained troops come. So even in second half of 1918, you've got 18-year-old boys coming out from England and joining the army. They're sufficiently well trained, they can follow a barrage. The attacks are quite simple. We're not asking to do anything particularly complicated, but they're actually pretty good at doing it in a way I don't think their predecessors of 1916 were. That's a lot of track record. It's about experience, it's about training, it's about leadership. Had it in spades in 1918 when they hadn't had it earlier.
Yes.
You mentioned the German construction of the Hindenburg line. So how much was known about the fact that they were doing it? Why did they do it? And how good a decision was it to do it?
Okay, taken from the German point of view, it's a really excellent decision because by falling back to the Hindenburg line, for those who don't know, the Hindenburg line is constructed roughly 20 miles in the rear of the Somme battlefield. It's state of the art, as in it's not sort of scrubby trenches, it's redoubts, it's emplacements, it's very well fortified. The Germans realised that actually fighting for the Somme battlefield, they're on a hiding to nothing, particularly because German doctrine, also true in the Second World War, it's basically if you lose the position, you promptly counterattack it. John Terrain, very famous historian of the Somme, he described the true texture of the Somme not simply being British attacks, but German counterattacks. And that's one of the reasons why the Germans piled up their casualties. Rawlinson, remember about bite and hold? He wasn't wrong. Because once you capture a position and the Germans start throwing in attacks, it's a very good opportunity to push them. And my beef with him is actually placing it in a broader context of advance, not that the tactical idea is wrong. By falling back to the Hindenburg line, Siegfriedstellung, as the Germans call it, the Germans shortened the line by, I don't know how many miles, but a considerable number, meaning that more troops were available to be put into reserve. So that actually I think was a smart move. The downside from the German point of view is that by abandoning the battlefield, that actually is a traditional sign of defeating battle. And if you watch the version of the Battle of the Somme film, which was put out on DVD a few years ago by the Imperial War Museum, it's obviously from early 1917 because it ends up with showing a map of the territory which has been captured on the Somme, Germans having pulled back. So the implication is quite clearly this is a victory in traditional sense. Who's holding the battle at the end? It's not the Germans, it's the Allies. What do the British know about it? Well, they became aware relatively early on because the British, until certainly early September 16, really dominate the sky. So they're flying reconnaissance missions into the German rear. They see what is being constructed. Haig knows about this. He chooses, for whatever reason, to ignore it in his still quite expansive plans for advances in September and October 1916. I've written a biography of him. I'm not going to attempt to defend him. He's got that wrong. Simple as that. I think that the British also underplayed the significance of that in the battles to come, because it's not only a new position, it also shows the way the Germans are changing their defensive tactics. So, at the beginning of the battle, the Germans are holding trench lines as you would expect, sort of 3 lines of parallel lines of wiggly trenches. Soon they abandoned those pretty effectively and went towards a much looser position of effectively holding shell holes, backed up by machine guns and counter-attack troops, which is because if you have a trench, basically it's a target for the enemy to aim at. If you don't have a trench, if you occupy much more loosely, it's much more effective. And the logical stage beyond that is to go for this very strongly defended position, which is very deep, sort of the positions I talked about earlier. I don't think the British actually understood the full implications of that until they bumped into it early in 1917. So, they don't get everything right, I think that's fair to say. Yes.
Gary, you mentioned morale, and I think you've written that at the end of the Somme, the morale of the British Army was still remarkably high, and yet I think on the German side, their morale took a real hit with many graveyards of the German army. That's sort of surprising on first blush, because such an inexperienced army, suffering such losses, very little territorial gain, and the sort of the enthusiasm and the optimism at the start of the campaign. Why do you think the morale actually stood up so well?
It's a fascinating question, one I've been wrestling for my entire professional life. I did my PhD on this sort of stuff. The particular circumstance at the end of the Somme is that the army is no longer naive. If it was ever naive, it is no longer. They actually know what war means. They know in terms of casualties and all the rest of it. And so the scales have dropped from their eyes in a sense. But at the end of the day, you're standing up somewhere where you couldn't stood up 6 months earlier. You have captured the ground. The Germans have fallen back in front of you. Clausewitz, it's a well-known fact that every staff college lecturer needs to mention Clausewitz at least once in their class. Clausewitz said that one of the ways in which morale is maintained is by a phrase like bathing in the sunshine of victory. In 1916, the British Army does enough. By British, I also include Empire forces. Does enough to think that, yeah, we've had a success. And next year, things are going to be better. And of course, at least when they kick off at Arras, that appears to be the case. Broader terms, the sorts of things which maintain the morale of the British soldier on the Western Front. It's a cohesive society. It's a society in which is deferential, in the sense that there's a belief that the working classes know their place. The toffs are sort of leaders of society, and the toffs look after their men. The whole thrust of my PhD was about officer-man relations, paternalism, and that sort of stuff. That's really important. So when you have got the French army, for example, will go to exactly the same sort of problems. The French officer corps is notoriously bad at looking after their soldiers. One of the reasons it collapses in mutiny in the spring of 1917. British Army is very, very good at looking after its soldiers. You know, at one level, it's a company commander writing home to his wife to send out mince pies and clean socks and that sort of stuff. It's built into the way that officers behave, that they take their men out of the line, they make sure that they have baths, they respect their feet, they give them leisure, they take them to the seaside, they play football matches, that sort of stuff. The British pay a lot of attention to maintaining morale. And armies that do that tend to survive in a way that others don't. The French army are very poor at doing that. The Russian army is falling apart. The closest actually is probably the Germans. German officers also have a paternalist attitude, and they're not quite the same thing. And also, ultimately, they believe in why they're fighting. One of the best examples of this I discovered, or rather the sort of theoretical underpinning, is a very good book by an Oxford historian, I beg his pardon, Adrian Gregory, called, I think it was The Last Great War or something like that. And he looks at attitudes of the British working classes. Basically, why did they keep fighting? Not just in the army, the navy, and the air force, on the home front as well, because there's all sorts of privations. And he says that the basic idea is that the British soldier, British citizen if you like, and it's overwhelmingly working class society, I would say it's 80% working class. Things aren't great. In fact, from our point of view, we'd be horrified by the conditions they live in. Yet compared to their parents, their grandparents, they've done well. Partly this is sometimes through government action. So for example, old age pensions were introduced in 1908. Sometimes it's through collective actions. trade unions have actually made a real difference to working people's lives. And the worry is, if the Germans win, this will be snatched away from us. So they actually buy into society. And as long as there's this sort of level of patriotism which is tapping in to this sense of, you know, why are we fighting? It's basically to maintain what we've got. Same way, sometimes you get this terrible, ignorant people, not historians from Australia and New Zealand say, why did the Anzacs fight? It wasn't Australia and New Zealand's war. Yes, it was. Apart from anything else, the Royal Navy was the thing which kept what they would call the Yellow Peril, Japanese away and all the rest of it. And they were British, most of them, because they were speaking British, as well as Australian, Canadian, and what that happens to be. They thought very differently than we think today, but nonetheless, once you start to analyse those societies, the white settler society, the British society, it's a lot more cohesive than people might think, and that plays out in morale on the home front and out on the battle front.
Final question.
My question really flows from the last one and your answer. Did the experience then of the men who fought at the Somme, the bakers, the bank clerks, cricketers, footballers, have any impact on recruitment into the regular army in the post-war years?
Oh, right, thank you. Less than you might think. Because don't forget that conscription was introduced in early 1916, so by the end of the Somme, you're getting large numbers of conscripts coming through. After the war, well, it's the war to all end the war, so we never have one like that again. And so you find recruiting posters in the 20s emphasising sport, football, cricket. Go somewhere like Malta or India, it's in the sunshine. I mean, the worst you're going to have to put up with is fighting a few Afghans or what have you. Nobody in the 20s thinks they're going to go through something like this again. When things start to change, in the middle of the 30s, it becomes obvious, to those who like to see, war was coming. Then the reaction is very interesting. You have a short-lived and quite shallow pacifist movement. Doesn't really last very long. You have some people, men, telling their sons, whatever you do, don't join the infantry. That's a very common thing. But at least equally, you get a generation of young men who are thinking, my dad went through it, my uncle went through it, my other brother went through it, now it's my turn. I want to prove my manhood. I know it's nearly dinner time, so I'll be very quick with this one, but I remember sitting down in Normandy on a battlefield 15, 20 years ago, and talking to this old guy who had been there. And I said, well, what age did you come out to? I joined when I was 18, I was out when I was 19. Why did you do it? Did you not know about the fighting in Normandy and Casino and Western Front? Yeah, of course I did, but how do you think you're immortal? And you want to do what your dad did? I think, yeah, it's possibly you and me. I was a terrible coward as a teenager, still am now. I would not have been one of those people, but surprising numbers of people were.
Thank you very much, Gary. We'll take some more questions at dinner. Dinner is